Okay, so that's a good intro. It sounds like I am totally up myself. World-class engineering, I'm going to tell you how to do it. The reality is that there's a story behind this, and I'll dig into that in a sec. So hi, my name's Mike. My name tag might say Michael. I prefer Mike if you can call me that. We had at 1.3 Michaels at Octopus in a company of about 26 people. So things got a bit confusing. We had to come up with different names for each other. So if I'm honest with you today, I'm actually a little bit nervous. The funny thing is that in a week's time, I'm going to be singing in front of 15,000 people. The thing is, you've got lights shining at you, you can't see they're there, you get to practice 100 times and you know you're going to nail it. Whereas today, I'm going to tell you some honest stories, I'm going to probably be a little bit embarrassed about it, and then to stand up on the stage after Simon when he's like polished as, I feel like a guy that's just getting the job done. So thank you, that was an excellent talk before, Simon. So I thought I'd throw a slide in to encourage myself. I'm an expert. Okay, high five, I can do this. I'm an expert in my problems, and that's what I'm here to share with you today is, well, actually not my problems necessarily, that could get a bit personal, but more to dig in to understand some of the problems we've faced as a company growing to the point we are now. And I'm not going to stand here and say I've got a solution for exactly where you're at, because we're a product company, we do a certain thing, I've got certain people working with me, we've experienced different problems and found different answers to them. So what I'm going to do today is try to give us some takeaways. So I want to share with you some principles that really matter to me. I want to share some relatable stories, or hopefully relatable stories. I want to hope that everybody walks out of here with maybe just one idea for a next step that you can take, or maybe if you've already nailed this and you are world class and a similar aspiration, it's validating what you've already learned. And finally, I'll show you a reading list of things I've really enjoyed in the last year, because I find that to be one of the most useful things out of any presentation I see. So one day I'm in a one-on-one with my CEO. I'm the VP of engineering there. Sounds like a fancy title. Some people call me the herder of cats. So I'm in my one-on-one with the CEO, and in typical developer fashion, Paul says, as a CEO, I want, and I take a breath, and he takes a breath, and I'm trying to figure out what he's going to say next. And he says, a world-class engineering team. And I immediately respond, that sounds great, me too. What's it going to cost? I thought he was going to say, I want to build some feature, as he's always dreaming of the future. And so I take a moment and I sort of ask myself, well, hang on, why do you actually want that? And to dig into it a little bit, he tells a story about when he was a teenager and sort of just read some books and fell in love with programming and thought, one day I'm going to build a world-class software engineering company like the other ones that I love seeing out there in the market. So I've always wanted to. And then another part of the conversation, which was actually a bit more scary, was we actually need to. And this is where part of hopefully a semi-relatable story comes up, is that Octopus started in 2011 as an idea that was innovative. People were doing it, we were doing it as a consultancy, going to different companies and automating people's deployments and operating their applications. And it was a nice blue ocean that we were swimming in when Paul founded the company, and there was lots of good food out there. But all of a sudden nowadays we look around and we see a lot of blood in the water. There's a lot of competition in our space. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are in there trying to carve up the market that we'd sort of set ourselves aside for. And so one of the ways that we could go about competing in that is to build a sales-driven company, and we actually don't want to. We want to build an engineering-driven company, a product-driven company, a product that is bought and not sold. So we need to. And then other questions start flowing, what, how, and when. And then he says, well, that's why I pay you the big bucks, so I can sleep at night while you take care of this. So therein lies the world-class engineering problem. It's not saying we are, it's an ideal that we're aspiring to, and I've been given the responsibility to do some of that. So I stop for a moment and I go home that night and I start to get overwhelmed. This is a universally big problem to me. I've never been here. I'll be real honest, like I said, I haven't been through 5 startups to this point and say I know how to take the team to the next stage. A lot of us at Octopus here in Brisbane haven't been here before. We're figuring it out as we go, but we're trying to learn from other people who've paved the way in front of us. So I find myself a little bit confused about where to start, and one of the principles that I really like to live by that's so pithy is think big, start small. That whole thing of being overwhelmed by this big problem, but at least just start somewhere, do something. So my poor old elephant here, that's another adage, eat the elephant one bite at a time. So I don't know where I'll start, but he looks a bit concerned. So I start thinking about, are we world class? Is it a yes or no thing? Is there somebody who'll tell me that? Is it a subjective or objective? Can I get a certificate that says, yes, we've made it? And I can walk up to Paul and say, there we go, we're world class, tick. Maybe it's a little bit like this chart. See my world class chart? I like that. As you can see the pixelation on the edges. World class, man. So if you put in enough time or effort or cleverness or all of the above, maybe processes. Maybe that's what helps you get towards world-classness. That's my trademarked vertical axis there. Actually, as I look at it subjectively, I think our world-class journey has been a little bit wiggly. Now, was that because early in the days, we nailed it, we're in the blue ocean, but then the company was 3 people and a world-class person decided to go on a new adventure? Is that what caused a downtick? Maybe we haven't kept a check on unconstrained tech debt and we're going slow because of that reason. Maybe we made some bad hires along the way. Maybe we failed to innovate. There's a whole bunch of things you might be able to throw into those downticks. It's not very comforting to have no understanding as to why that may happen. Wouldn't it be nice if we all started and knew exactly what to do and we could asymptotically approach world-classness without really trying and just let time be the factor? So hopefully what I'm going to do today is share some thoughts and experiences and hopefully backed up by some evidence of improvements we've seen that helps us accept the wiggles of where we were. And I can't go back in time and change history, but what I can do is go back in time and remember the lessons we've learned and hopefully aim for some principles that will help us be more consistent in the future. So back in the day, I worked on this thing. It's the RF-111C. I worked for Boeing for 4 years. My first job out of uni as a trained aerospace avionics engineer. And that's when I got introduced to software and fell in love with it. And one of the things that I noticed as we were working on this was this 4-letter acronym that came out, not around then, but earlier in the piece around the 1980s, called CMMI. And I did a bit of a search on this because as I'm thinking world-class, and then my old history came back and I went, well, Boeing was a world-class company along with Lockheed Martin and some of those others in that space, and they had to do CMMI. And then I had a bit of a search on the web to make sure I didn't dismiss the idea. And now there's V2, came out in 2018, and it's now agile friendly, which is really exciting if you know CMMI at all. Now, I'm not an expert at this, and my picture, yep. Okay, so some of the pictures are getting washed out, my bad. But one of the reasons why the CMMI was introduced is for vendor shopping. Okay, so you go out, you get your certificate at a certain level of CMMI, and there were projects that government, Australian government is one of them as well, would say you must be at least CMMI level 4 to bid for this tender. Now, the thing is that I don't want a certificate. That would be nice to show Paul one day and say, I did it. But we want to be world class. We don't want a certificate that says that we're world class according to somebody else. So then I actually thought, no, I need to not dismiss CMMI at the outset. So here we go. Here's another 25 minutes on CMMI, just jokes. But if I read the top here, this actually sounds really freaking cool. The intent behind CMMI level 5 is that things are stable and flexible. Actually, that sounds really good. The organisation's focused on continuous improvement. It's built to pivot and respond to both opportunity and change in that red ocean that we live in now. The organisation's stability provides a platform for agility and innovation. I mean, that sounds really good. What have I got to do to get there? I don't actually want to dig that far, but that actually sounds a lot like what I've been told Agile is all about. Sadly, my experience as a consultant with a lot of different companies is this looks like Agile too, where things are unpredictable and reactive, right? Work gets completed and it's often delayed and over budget. Yeah, we got smiles here. Even before I looked up CMMI, I thought to myself, I'm just going to sit down and start writing words, subjective words about how I see other world-class companies behaving, or maybe seeing the properties or attributes of them as I look at it. And these are the things that I came up with. I'm not an authority. I just threw some stuff in little balls and decorated them so you could see them. So the first one I thought is they attract and retain world-class people. They proudly talk about how they work. They do what matters without slowing down. They innovate and they follow trends. I think both are just as important. You think about other world-class companies you see, this is true of all of them. And competitors actually feel threatened. And in my history at Octopus, I've been there for about 5 years now, I've seen us live through all of these. One interesting story there is that there are teams in other competitors' companies that are dedicated to reading our blogs and marketing detail just to know what we're up to in that space so they can understand how to compete with that. And for better or worse, they're being really effective as well. But this is a place where we've been before, and I think that's really great. And I showed before, I think we've been on this interesting curvy kind of experience. Now, if I look at these and I think I could talk about some of them, but they're more attributes or outputs. And there are some of these that I think hopefully I can share some of our story, success story today, that you can have control over, some of them not. So competitors feel threatened. Can I go out and buy some of that with some money? Not really. It's more an outcome of what you are doing. And so what I want to speak to today are two main points. And This is attract and retain world-class people and do what matters without slowing down. Again, not claiming we're perfect at it, but I've hopefully got some lessons that you can walk away with or validate what you're already doing. So starting with attracting and retaining world-class people. Again, I sort of thought about this, and that in many cases I've been in before where I'm working in a small company in South Brisbane with 20 people working there, and if the CEO came up to me and said, I want to build a company that attracts world-class people, you'd possibly fall off your chair laughing because it feels like an insurmountable obstacle. But again, think big, start small gets us to a point where I say, rather than thinking, how do I attract somebody that's out there on the world stage in my little company, what would actually prevent people from being attracted and retained in my company? So imagine this, it sounds like a bad joke, but imagine a world-class person walks into a bar, I mean your place. What would actually cause them to turn around and walk back out? Or what might cause them to stay? And I think these are some table stakes. I threw them all up on the slide so you can read them. I'll quickly read out and talk to some of them. So one big thing in our world is people. They're not resources, they are people, are trusted and powerful. There feels like there's an opportunity to make a difference, not only in the company where they're working, but also through the company as a platform. So doing something that matters in the world. They do great, or the whole company does great things without slowing down. So GSDTM. There's a clearly articulated set of principles, and an interesting thing there is, and those principles should align. I've contracted and consulted to companies where our principles didn't align, and there was a sense of just wanting to get out of there. So I don't want to retain people where our principles don't align, I'd rather they find somewhere where they do. There's radically candid feedback. TM, again, you might see reference that later. Money is not an issue, and that doesn't mean you pay everybody a lot of money. It just means we aim to pay within market, and we want to make it that money is not something that we have to spend a lot of time fretting over. It's a big distraction. And there's a sense of future, there's a sense of growth, and there's a sense of adventure. And when any of these things start to tarnish, that's when I think world-class people will start to look elsewhere because they've had this in their past. So if you want to compete on that stage, I think these are some just handy principles to keep in mind. So the first idea I'm going to throw at you is one we call Octopus people. Now what this is a set of principles, and I'll show you the foundation of this. Have you ever heard these words in your organisation before? I'm not growing professionally. I didn't know what was expected of me. That can be surprising in a performance review, right? I don't know what I need to do to grow in my role. It's always this guessing game. I don't understand why that person got promoted and I didn't. Or maybe just why did that person get promoted? The feedback my manager gives me isn't actionable. If you've heard this or anything like it, there's probably a good reason for it. So what we did, and I did this I used to work at Redify, a consultancy, now Colour of the Rainbow. And I was asked to do performance reviews, and I got given a skills matrix that I had to evaluate people against that I hadn't worked with for 9 months. And go back in time, and it was human resource ease. It wasn't written in a language I understood. And I found it really hard to do, and you just kind of went, oh, look, I don't want to be bad to the person. I'll just go tickety tick tick flick and give it to them and make sure they get their pay rise. So what we did was sat down and wrote up a whole bunch of examples about the things we liked about working with certain people and things we didn't, gathered them together and wrote these principles. And I open sourced it when I was at Redify, and then eventually when I ended up at Octopus, a few years into my journey there, we actually embraced and extended it into Octopus people. So these are some extracts. I think they're plain English, they're not perfect, but they're understandable. Every venture has mundane tasks, but I'm the one that can be trusted to get them done and get them done right, and usually with a handful of ingenuity. That's something a person can aim for. That's something that you can talk to as their manager. My contributions to team discussions are net positive, informative, and helpful. I've been in conversations where this has been the opposite, and it's really nice to walk out of that conversation, tap the person on the shoulder and say, hey, this is one of the principles we live and die for. How do you think that went? I happily take responsibility for my own mistakes, and I learn from the mistakes of others. So these are just some foundational principles, but I actually do use that word intentionally, foundational. I really believe that if you don't have this kind of thing in place, it actually undermines anything else you do, be it agile, be it architecture diagrams and decision records that we learned about before. So the outcomes of this is people will know the next steps. Actionable feedback is easier, and that's a really important thing. If you're in a leadership position today, this is enough reason to actually do something like this, because what we actually say is during your feedback cycle, copy paste the words that are already written for you and give them to the person. And you don't actually have to come up with them on your own. And the last thing is that everybody is growing. So some ideas to make it happen if you want to take these home. Jump onto our open source repo and steal it. Feel free. There's words in there that won't apply to you, but there's hopefully words that will. And they're, again, not perfect, but you might be able to extend it or change it for your own situation. You don't need to build the wheel from scratch. The other idea is build your own. Like I said, just write down examples of behaviours. You might have listened to other talks by the Netflix Culture Deck. Okay, they have a similar kind of idea, and I heard about that a long time after we'd done it at Redify. Just the same idea. It's simple. Write down examples. You know, when you see something during your work week and you go, I hate that, it really drives me nuts, write it down somewhere and keep it for later, because then it might inform the kind of foundations you do here. The last point I make here is revisit it often, which is a really neat segue into this next section. So idea number 2 I'll hand to you today is radically candid feedback. Now, I'm not going to take credit for this, we'll talk about that in a sec, but I want to just think about this for a little bit honestly, because this was our story. Do people in your organisation actually speak truth to power, or do they keep their mouths shut? Do people frequently seek feedback for the work they've done, and they do it openly? Are people happily accepting challenging feedback, or is there a bit of a hissy fit or a concern afterwards? Can people actually tell you the next growth step right now? If you asked them face to face, hey, what are you working on? What's your next step? And are people actually enjoying giving that kind of feedback? If any of those aren't the case, I recommend this book. It's a Bible to us. We actually forced everybody to read it at Octopus in the last 12 months, went through it chapter at a time, turned it into real life examples, did it in our one-on-ones and spent time really reflecting on it. I started reading this book thinking that Kim was going to stop at the point where she talks about giving radically candid feedback. It really doesn't. It actually really digs into driving results collaboratively, talking to people about their future. So if you haven't read it, it's really good information. It's worth getting into. So at a top level, it's this interesting matrix of cares personally and challenges directly feedback. It is frequent and timely, and it is founded on principles. I've sort of thrown that one in because I think that's where the anchor really sits. So making it happen, get the book and read it. It's a few days of a good read. Introduce immediate feedback. We started here with praise first, and radically candid praise being an idea that it's not, well done, mate, good job. It's actually really specific, it's timely, and it's a good example to others of behaviour to mimic. We also make sure that everybody is having effective one-on-one meetings. And I don't just say one-on-one meetings where you kind of go, what you're working on, let's get a status report. It's actually really effective stuff that says, what's on your mind right now? Oh, I'm really frustrated about this thing. Let's do something to change that. Coaching happens in there as well. And we used to do annual performance reviews. I was talking about that example at Redify. 9 months ago, I worked with somebody. I had to do a skills matrix. I don't have anything current to work with. We do it quarterly. We actually moved to a trimesterly thing now because we're doing a different shape. And we use 360s as well. So what I'm going to say here is that this is an important kind of coupling with the previous point. Every time we go through a review cycle, we go back to our principles and make sure they still make sense. So when we're talking about architecture decision documents or decision registers, going back to them frequently is one way to make sure they're staying up to date. Does it still make sense? The same sits here for our principles. So the results are actually tangible. This is the results of an engagement survey that we do internally. I've neglected it for the last couple of quarters, but this big arrow shows you where we realised there was a bit of a problem. It shows you where we actually started implementing all of this. And if you can see there, every factor that we were surveying for made a distinct upward trend up into toward the 80th percentile, except for one, which was the little pink one there that took a 1 or 2% dip. Okay, cool. The second big section I want to talk about is doing work that matters without slowing down. This is something that we're facing as a real problem at Octopus now. And so I'm sort of right in the middle of trying to help solve this problem. So again, feels like a big universe, but start big. I think big, start small. So this is where we find ourselves. Team members and projects feel like projects go on and on without end. Big sunk cost fallacy sits behind that one. Product managers can't find time to think strategically about the product. They're always on the run. And founders are asking themselves, Why can't we get features out the door like we used to in the early days? Now, if you've read the Shape Up book by Basecamp, you'll recognize these 3 points. I literally opened that book and started reading it and immediately went, I've had these conversations. I literally wrote them down as problems I wanted to solve. And I find myself reading that book with a newfound respect. So I'll get on, that's the book there, but you can jump online and get that for free. I'll put a link up at the end. And a disposable answer to this is do agile. I've heard that so many times before in my past, just do agile. And it's really easy to say that you do agile with a capital A on purpose, but I've found in practice it's actually much harder to be agile. And before I said we want to be world class, we don't want to get a certificate that says we are world class. So alluding to the talk before by Simon, I just really quickly shoveled that in. But I think one of the reasons for this is we blindly apply surface level principles. We'll go and read a blog post or come to a talk like this and go, that's awesome, I'm going to go home and do that. But you haven't done the deep thinking and reflection to map those ideas to your organisation, where it's at, and build that journey. And the second thing I've noticed is that we've stopped teaching people these fundamental principles. We've really let go of that and assume everybody must know Agile because we've heard about it and are really bored about people talking about this at YOW conferences, for example. We've all moved on to microservices. No, we moved from microservices. Where are we now? Okay, so if we think about a software engineering team or an organisation like a machine, okay, there's inputs, there's outputs, and there's outcomes. And there's this control systems theorist that comes to mind from my training as an aerospace avionics engineer. And I think about feedback loops like from the outputs, what helped or hindered execution? Or from the outcomes, did we actually change customer behavior the way that we expected to or we feared that we would? So I want to talk to two ideas. One of them is do work that matters. And I think this all sits squarely in the input side of this factor. So we're going to focus on inputs. Have you heard these before? We all thought this was important. Why isn't anyone using it? We've done this 5, 6, 7 times at Octopus in our history. That decision caused more problems than it solved. So speaking to what Simon was saying before, surface level, let's go microservices. 6 years later, you're going, why the hell did we choose this? Maybe because you didn't think deeply enough. We didn't want you to spend that much time solving this problem. That happened to us 3 months ago. Interesting story if you want to dig into it in the break. Okay, so idea number 1, do work that matters. The first point I'd like to make here is start with the problem. This is another principle we're really trying to encourage at Octopus. So one of the points here is discover missing inputs. We're missing some right now. We don't have salespeople on the ground like I mentioned before, so we don't know why people don't buy our product. There's a missing input. Another thing is that when people churn away from our product, we actually have no idea why they churned away. Another missing input. Sounds really obvious at face value, but until we started digging into this, we didn't realize there was missing context in our decision making. Oops, sorry. And the second thing we'll dig into is higher quality inputs. So back to Simon again, take more time to understand the full problem. Just alluding to the conversation before, so if you didn't see that or you're watching the video later on, jump in and see Simon Brown's video where he talks about this. Are you missing some context? And I talked about some of these ones that we already have, but there's some that you might know about today that you're actually not talking about. Maybe during your builds and your execution on what you decide to do, you're not feeding that information back in, or you're not feeding it at the right level. Another thing that, because we're an on-premises product from the ground up, we have a cloud version now, but we don't think like a SaaS company properly yet, and we don't get proactive error and performance telemetry. There you go, a little bit of dirty laundry for you, right? If I was in a SaaS company that was built SaaS from the ground up, of course you'd have that. Why wouldn't you? It's easy thinking. So we're missing some inputs. A second thing is that I would encourage you to take your existing inputs and make them higher quality. Quite often I find that we have a really bad signal to noise ratio and we don't spend enough time getting the inputs and really understanding them and then communicating them well. One of the problems I've seen in the past is when we do weekly or 2 weekly sprints, or maybe it's a big project that's turned into 2 weekly death marches. What we find is that at the end of those death marches, we don't take time to reflect. We don't take time to gather our inputs together and really understand what they mean and how they could impact the next step. So we've moved to a cadence of 8 weeks where we take time, 2 whole weeks at the end, to give breathing room, to think, to formulate our inputs, and to make sure that the decisions we're making are well informed. The second thing that we're doing is improving our signal to noise ratio. So we have a lot of support requests that come through for our product, let's say 200 a month, and it doesn't seem like much compared to other companies. But what we don't do is spend time understanding the trends. And so what we're looking at is we categorize those into 3 categories. If you listen to some talks by Atlassian, they do a similar thing: reliability, usability, and features. And then we're starting to dig into those and understand under that R, when there were bug reports or performance concerns, what is the actual source of them? And can we get the signal to noise ratio up to a point where we can make decisions that are informed, not just ignore the big noise out there on the floor? So at the end of the day, no matter how good your inputs are, it's still a gamble. And again, if you've read the Shape Up book, they talk about this word betting, and we use that internally. No matter how good your inputs are, you're probably missing some information. And a quick story about this is we use user voice as one of the ways to aggregate this stuff together. Sometimes it's called the desert of broken dreams. But what we do is we look at the top 10 and we say 700 votes for this thing. So multi-tenancy was one of those, and we knew we had to do it, and we knew it was going to be great, and we knew it was going to be hard, but we set off on that year-long journey and we finally got it done, and it worked, and a whole bunch of people buy Octopus today because we support multi-tenancy. The next one down, or very close to it, was Service Fabric. And I think what happened is after we shipped multi-tenancy, all those votes became available, and then people went to Build Conference and they went, oh, Service Fabric, we need Service Fabric, and turned up and we got all these votes for Service Fabric, and we thought, well, let's go implement it. So we spent 3 months implementing it. Guess how many people actually went to the effort to architect their application into Service Fabric shape and use Octopus to deploy it? Oh, okay, no guesses. 4, 0, 2, 1. Okay, it's more than 0. There's actually quite a few doing it, but it's nowhere near enough. And of course, now we find out that, well, Service Fabric is not the future. Okay, so the second idea we'll dig into is optimize your outputs. Now, so much time and effort and thinking has been poured into this over the years. And again, throwaway comment, do Agile, that's how you optimize your outputs. So here's some comments that I've seen internally. It's taking so long because the scope keeps not shrinking, growing. Technical debt is slowing us down. We keep revisiting the decisions we made in the past. Oh, I should have put Simon's face on that one too. I can't focus on being pulled in way too many directions. This is very real for us. Everything seems important. I don't know what to ignore. Or we've already invested 3 months. We need to keep going. Okay, so this is the second to last slide. So the first thing we've done here is we shape up our inputs. So again, alluding to the book, we take time to understand what we're going to do and the risk we're incurring with that before we go about it. What that means is instead of my CEO going and having a sales conversation with somebody, coming back and saying, hey, great idea, why don't you go do this? All of a sudden, we've got this Skunkworks project that came out of nowhere that took 6 months that we didn't really expect. Why did this take so long? I thought you'd invest 4 weeks in that. So we're very careful about making sure our inputs are constrained, are well understood, and that we understand what rat holes exist there. We right-sized our cadence, and so this is something that you might want to consider as well. What we found was that when you're doing weekly or 2 weekly, the amount of time that you decide not to invest in making sure you're understanding your inputs, getting the signal-to-noise ratio high, it becomes this real concern of overhead. We found that with 8 weeks, it actually does give us enough time to do that well. Protect focus. This is a real cry. In the last 6 months, we've really forced on this. Focus, 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 focus. What we found was if we can shape up the work appropriately, we can actually leave the team alone for 6 weeks to focus, build momentum, and get stuff done, and leave them fairly autonomously to hammer the scope down. So which is the next point, fix the time and vary the scope. What we've done here is we've said, this is the next point really, stop by default. This is a huge mistake I've made many times on projects where I've been a lead, and we thought, next sprint, you're going to keep going, you're not going to stop. At Octopus nowadays, there is no option but stopping. We stop, and there's no question about it. You don't feel bad, there's no sunk cost fallacy. We stop, and we look, and we decide what to do next. And sometimes we continue, but we did it deliberately and we didn't fall into it. The last thing I'll mention here is nowadays we invest about 20%, actually it's more like 25% in what we call sharpening the saw, if you know Stephen Covey's Habits of Highly Effective People. We actually do that as a company. The entire company is on this cadence. 25% of our time goes into sharpening, so we're better next time around. So there's the picture from The Shape Up book, we've adopted this fairly squarely, realising that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel here. There's some really good ideas in that book, dig into it. We renamed Cool Down to Sharpening the Saw at the moment, and here's the reading list. I have 2 minutes left. I made it. I made it. So there's 4 books that I really recommend reading. I'm halfway through some of them. I'm really enjoying them. I'll leave that slide on the screen and leave 2 minutes for any questions.